So it's official. There are two new species of lepomids in the genus Lepomis. Those are the common sunfishes, and you may have already caught them, and you just need to adjust your life list. I am Koaw, and this is KNFS, where we anglers are always learning and sharing knowledge about fish and fishes. I've been swamped with my doctoral research and a big largemouth bass project, but I just finally had to get on this lepomid change and get it to you guys. If you caught my last northern sunfish video, you knew this impending splitting from the Longear Sunfish Complex was going to happen. We just didn't know how many splits would occur. For a good amount of years in our world of fisheries, we've only recognized two species out of this complex. The northern sunfish, Lepomis peltastes, and the Longear sunfish, Lepomis megalotis. A 2022 study by Kim et al. Suggested that there should be 6 species total within this complex, but only 2 new species of the 4 suggested new species were actually derived from the complex. Before we get into these 2 new species and the information you need to know to identify whether you've actually caught one or not already, let's just go over briefly what a splitting actually is. So a splitting is the breaking apart of one species into many species. Splitting is suggested via some peer-reviewed research. In this case, this study provided genetic-based evidence and some morphological-based evidence saying that all these lineages are genetically distinct and should be recognized as different species. After the study is published with the splitting suggestion, time goes by and certain authorities, aka some high-up fisheries people who are biologists, ichthyologists, taxonomists, etc., that have what I like to call publishing power, need to hop on board and say, okay, yeah, your data makes sense, that's acceptable. Overall, the splitting process is rather bureaucratic and drab, and sometimes it seems like arbitrary decisions are being made. But that's just how it is. And I am now calling this splitting official because the 2 new species have been accepted as new species by the authoritative scientists of the American Fisheries Society in their official publication, and right after Eschmeyer's Catalog of Fishes also fell in suit. So alas, myself and most all other biologists within fisheries will accept these 2 new species. Another thing I want to bring up, and I know I've mentioned using iNaturalist before, because iNaturalist is great, if you want to go figure out where to fish, where the fish may be. But it's important to remember that iNaturalist is not an authority on systematics and taxonomy. iNaturalist has people called curators who may or may not actually be scientists that have the power on the platform to elevate and rearrange species. Again, they're just doing this on their own accord. They're not officially recognized by any sort of taxonomic authority. So when this Kim study came out suggesting this complex gets split up, there were a number of people on iNaturalist, these curators, that just started adding and removing and rearranging the Longear Sunfish complex. They shouldn't have been doing that. So bottom line, iNaturalist is a citizen scientist website. It's not official content. Information must be taken under question of its reliability. So let's briefly cover these 2 new species. The first new species is Lepomis aquilensis, the Plains Longear Sunfish, of which we find throughout Texas, parts of Louisiana, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Mexico. The second species is Lepomis solis, the Gulf Longear Sunfish, of which we find in parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, maybe squeezing a bit farther northeast there. Some people might be referring to this as the Swampland Longear Sunfish, but since the American Fisheries Society has officially published this with the common name Gulf Longear Sunfish, that's what all my content is going to do. So 2 of those lineages that the paper suggested didn't actually yet receive species status. They did not get elevated. Those are Lepomis Ouachita and Lepomis Ozark. And I have to say those scientific names loosely because those aren't official scientific names right now. That's just what the paper suggested they be called. As of now, they remain Longear Sunfish or Lepomis megalotis. I haven't yet reached out to the researchers involved in this to figure out why these 2 lineages didn't get elevated, and it may just play into the fact that the 2 species that got elevated to species status were already described as species long ago. but over the course of time they got de-elevated, and now it's easier to re-elevate them. If we look at this GDI analysis, which is just sort of a standardized way of saying should we elevate a species or not, everything fell into the ambiguous category. Nothing was definitive except for Lepomis peltastes, which has already been broken away from this complex as a distinct species. But I mean, if we look at Ouachita here, it has a higher GDI than aquilensis, which is the Plains Longear Sunfish. Yet the Plains got elevated and Ouachita did not. So it is quite possible we still might see this elevation in the next couple of years. Maybe. But as far as IDing these species go, it's still the same playbook as IDing Lepomis megalotis, the Longear Sunfish. There are some differences morphologically, but what's going to be most important is knowing your range. Know where you are. Pretty much location, location, location. And location is so important because pretty much most all species caught in the range overlaps are admixed specimens. Introgression happened, or current hybridization, which means you can't definitively call them a Plains Longear Sunfish or a Longear Sunfish if you find them in this region. In this region, the Gulf Longear Sunfish and the Longear Sunfish have swapped genes, so these specimens are mutts, so to speak. But I mean, the cool thing is, if you are inclusive of hybrids and introgress specimens in your life list, you could just add slots of these admixed specimens caught in these regions. Kind of add it as a different species, so to speak, even though it's an admixed specimen. And keep in mind that my map here is approximate. It's not exact. So morphologically, the physical characteristics, the study examined about 30 traits. And they did find that, yeah, you could distinguish species from each other within this complex, but nothing with 100% certainty. There's a high failure rate on everything, especially trying to tell them apart from the Longear Sunfish, which is in the central part of the range. I mean, what they did is they literally plugged in these 30 features into a statistical analysis and said, okay, if I have all of this, it's probably this. But what angler is going to sit there in the field and measure and count 30 different features on a fish and then go put it into a statistical test to determine what it is? Location, location. So for example, the Plains Longear Sunfish has a significantly smaller pectoral fin and smaller ear flap than the other lineages. And I got my hands on this study's data, and I just wrote a bit of code to analyze this. And yes, statistically, if you run a quick analysis comparing the Plains Longear Sunfish against the Longear Sunfish and the Gulf Longear Sunfish, it does have a statistically shorter opercular flap. When you look at the graph, where each one of those points represents a measurement taken on a fish within each group there, within each species, it's simply not practical to use ear flap length as an ID feature because there's so much overlap. And the same thing goes for pectoral fin length, where here it's measured as a percentage of the standard length. And it's the same thing. There's a lot of overlap. Yes, statistically speaking, the Plains Longear Sunfish has a shorter pectoral fin relative to the other two species. But with so much overlap, it's not like you can use that as a distinguishing feature. So, location. Now keep in mind that I'm excluding the lineages Ouachita and Ozark that are in these ranges from the Longear data, but when I do include them, it's the same picture. There's a ton of overlap. However, this data still has some cool highlights. For example, the Longear Sunfish of the Ozark lineage, when comparing these specimens to the Plains Longear Sunfish, there is a greater difference between the overall means of the opercular flap length, width, and angle. So aquilensis, the Plains Longear Sunfish, will generally have a shorter and thinner opercular flap at less of an angle. So here we see that the Plains Longear does have some outliers reaching above 40, but no recorded opercular flaps longer than 51% of the adjusted head length. So essentially, the vast majority of Plains Longear will not have an ear flap longer than 50% of the adjusted head length. An opercular flap width comparison doesn't offer too much, but we can see that Ozark has a thicker opercular flap on average, and the angle comparison here still has a lot of overlap, but notice that only 3 specimens of Ozark have no angle, or 0 angle, That means it's just a straight ear flap compared to the midline of the body, while the Plains Longear actually has a negative angle in some cases. So examining the ear flap can offer a cool comparison because there are sympatric populations of Longear Sunfish of the Ozark lineage and the Plains Longear Sunfish. These sympatric populations, they're not genetically admixing as they coexist. For example, in the Deep Fork River, in an area between Oklahoma City and Tulsa, that's in Oklahoma, they found specimens of the Plains Longear Sunfish and the Ozark lineage of the Longear Sunfish that were not genetically admixing and still living together in the same water system. Now that doesn't mean genetic admixing isn't happening, and I personally wouldn't be confident on an ID in this range without a genetic test, but if I did catch an adult specimen that had an opercular flap less than 20% of the adjusted head length with a 5-degree angle and maybe a 25% width, I'd be more inclined to think it's a Plains Longear. And if that ear flap was greater than 50% of the head length with, say, a 30-degree angle and being 35% wide, I'd lean towards a Longear Sunfish of the Ozark lineage. And there are some other fun comparisons in this data, like looking at the lateral line scales of the Ouachita lineage of the Longear Sunfish. This could be useful for comparisons against the Plains Longear, although this range overlap has some crazy admixed genes of Plains Longear, Longear Sunfish of the Ouachita lineage, and Northern Sunfish. Yes, Northern Sunfish. And as far as the Gulf Longear Sunfish versus the Longear Sunfish, there is no standout meristic or morphometric feature that is practical. Hence why location is key. Next year, I'm going to a fisheries conference in Texas and an aquaculture conference in Louisiana. So, you know that I will be sidetracking to capture photos and video of both the Plains Longear and the Gulf Longear in some good portions of those ranges. I'm almost done updating the Longear page on the ID guide on my website, and I will work on getting 2 good pages done for the new species. I might post some of these graphs with feature comparisons. The Longear Sunfish, just out of all the lepomids, has the most extensive amount of variance within the phenotypic expression. I mean, what they look like. Fish responsibly and good luck.